Hi. Thank you, Rich, for the great introduction. So today, as Rich was saying, we're going to talk about a group of people who have created a new way to communicate. They've empowered others, enabled the voiceless to speak up for themselves, recognize them as well, and in many ways created platforms for others to empower themselves and express themselves. I'm not talking about the internet or art. I'm talking about street art. And the artists here today, I'll introduce Swoon, Caledonia Curry, please come in. Caledonia
Hello.
is known for her intricately cut images that she places all over the world. She's also known for building boats and fooling the Coast Guard into giving her permits to float down the Hudson. The next artist I'd like to introduce is Vhils, Alexander Farto. Alex taught all of us that you can create by destroying. Alex literally carves into the sides of buildings portraits of people. Often people like the woman who sells flowers in downtown Oaxaca. He created her portrait inside the museum, a space she'd never been into. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce Angelo Milano. Angelo, come on out. Angelo's not an artist. His contribution is really that he started the first renegade street art festival. In a small town in southern Italy, he invited artists, including Caledonia and Alex, to place work in public space on his neighbors' homes and businesses without their permission or knowledge. So that wouldn't go over very well in Cambridge. I don't know how he made it work in Grottaglia. But one of the things that I'd like to talk a bit before we get started about street art is that, and rebellion, is in the research I've done, a couple of the things that have continuously come up is that the artists wanted to reach more people. They felt that the art world was isolated. They felt that it reached too many people, that it was inward looking. And they wanted to make it more accessible. Accessible in the form of language that they used, visual language, as well as its placement by putting it in public space. How do you sustain this? Street art is expensive. You create materials, you put it out in public space, you risk arrest. And there's no way to make any money on it. However, they even developed a business model, which again also inverts the traditional art model, that instead of selling one work of art for a lot of money to an individual or a museum, you sell editions for a little money to a lot of people. Sound familiar? It worked for Obama. So the thing here is so this, in many ways, inverted the elitist model. And well, here we are. We have to chat with them. So this is something I've always wanted to discuss, is the idea of agency. Callie, what led you, you were a student at Pratt, what led you to start putting your markup in public space?
Well, I had studied painting, and I came from a really small town, and so my concept of what art could be was very traditional. And then when I got to New York, and I could feel the kind of chute that they were encouraging us to go down, which in hindsight probably felt a bit like the slaughterhouse chute, that this is how you do it, and this is what you make, and this is where it goes, and these are the galleries that you show in. And I would walk into these galleries and just feel kind of suffocated and feel like people were looking at me like, what are you even doing in here? I mean, I was like a kid, I was a hick. And so I really felt very much like an outsider, even though I had gotten into this great school in New York City. And so I think I just brought a lot of anger and energy and desire to create something which connected with people deeply and which didn't kind of suffer the very clinical limitations as I perceived them in the art world. And so I just kind of looked at everyone. I just looked at what people were doing, and Gordon Matta Clark was chopping up buildings, and people were making soup kitchens, and there were just so many different forms of artistic expression that kind of exploded into my brain when I moved to the city, and I just wanted to make something. I loved the city, and I loved the walls and the textures, and I just wanted to make something that was part of it. I wanted to make it kind of inseparable. And so I started with this series of prints, and then doing that first action of just putting something outside, and being like, oh, this is illegal. And then you get into all these questions of like, well, who does own these walls and why? How does public space work in the city? Who has the right to participate in it, who doesn't, and so on. And so that kind of led me down a very long road.
Thank you. And Alex, you grew up in Lisbon, well, on the other side of the river, where the factories and warehouses were located. And after the end of the dictatorship, there were the Socialist Party started to paint these murals that glorified, socialism. And then Portugal joined the EU, and a ton of money came in, and then there were advertisements for the glorification of Audi. So how did that work for you?
I mean, so I basically started quite young. I mean, I was 13, and I was mostly doing, illegal graffiti and painting on trains, and it was sort of a way to. I think I got a lot of anger too, in a way, that filled me with a lot of things. By the fact that I was growing up in the suburbs, and quite, it's the suburbs of Lisbon, that it's not a main city in Europe, at least. So this drove me in a way to think a lot about what's the public space and what should be your participation in it. And this was what drove me to work on these walls. But at one point I started to think a lot about the reasons why and why I was doing it, and I started to try to push the work forward, and I started to reflect on all these things that changed in quite of a short period of time. It was a period of 20, 30 years. Part of it I didn't even live it. But there was one of the longest dictatorships in Europe, right-wing one, that closed the country for 60 years, and suddenly the country opened up, and as you told, there was a big boom with muralists and artists working on the public space to pass through their message. This was in the 70s, and then in the 80s there was this big boom with advertising outdoors everywhere. So you had kind of two systems that were working in the public space to pass through their message to the public in general. But these two realities were mixing sort of in the 90s where I was growing up, and you could see like two completely languages, and one was these murals that were kind of decaying and crumbling down and forgotten by everyone, and then the new advertisements were quite freshly new. And then the advertising went over these murals, and then the graffiti started to show up where I was part in it. I started to paint over all these layers. So it was like the walls were reflecting the changes that were going through the country. So at one point I started to reflect if, I should be just one more layer on all these layers, and why should I not like completely whitewash them and then just carve and expose all these layers that were behind? Because in the end they were part of what everyone was, because this public space affects us in every aspect of our lives.
So you were literally digging into the walls to reveal the past, like in this image here.
Yeah, and in a way exposing, making the invisible visible. And I picked a lot of portraits, and because they have a strong meaning with identity and what is identity today with all the globalization and so on. But all of this, I kind of noticed it in a small, it was in a small environment of Lisbon, and I was not in touch with the reality outside. And as soon as I started to do all these works, I started to get some attention from abroad. I think the internet played a big role there, because it started to we got in touch, used my works.
Yeah, exactly.
And I kind of got a relationship with other people that were kind of feeling the same. And then I started to do projects in different places. And for example, this project that we were showing in Shanghai, it's all of this process that was kind of fast in an environment where I was growing up. But in China, it was like in 10 years, you have 1,000% more like this build-up of layers. So I started to realize that you have some points in common, and that the work also makes sense when you go and travel and work with the layers of each city, because each city has their own layers and its own history. So that's how I see myself as and I mature in a way with the concept of the work.
Well, you're still only 14, so. And then Angelo. Angelo, your Renegade Street Art Festival, the Fame Festival, you thrive on chaos, and you brought chaos to your community, and I'm just wondering how you were able to do that and get out alive.
All right. It's easy answer, basically, because everything I made, which is we made with all these guys in my town, was based on improvisation and illegality, basically. Illegality, I'm not saying illegality like trying to be cool, like, you know, like right now, especially in this genre of art, being illegal still means being pure and being cool, but like that was the only way we could do it in my town. When I started this festival, there was not even an alternative. There was not a legal way to do it. Everything that has to happen in that place has to be immediate and out of your own improvisation again. So what I've done is just starting to invite all these guys from abroad to come and entertain me at first because I was bored, you know. That's exactly what happened. I went back from Northern Italy, where everybody goes, being from the south, where nothing happens outside then mom's food and the beach, which is entertaining enough. But you know, I wanted more. I was starving for something else. That's why I call the festival Fame, which in Italian means hunger. So,
but in English it's spelled fame.
Fame, yeah. I played with that thing because all these popular artists were coming, bringing their culture to my little place, and I was just very hungry for this. I had a huge appetite for this. So basically they came, and we didn't even lose time with politicians and local council and all these, are bad words allowed here? And all this bullshit. So we just started to do our own thing because we were into it, we liked it, and we had a goal. My first goal with this festival was at the time to bring lights on a huge issue that was going on in my town. Basically in southern Italy, the trash industry is manipulated and orchestrated by mafia, let's say, and Camorra actually. And in my town, they were installing a trash dump without anybody knowing it, right? All the population was completely obscure of these things. And when we figured out, I mean, I really needed to expose this. And at the time, because I think things changed very fast, this kind of art had a real huge communicative potential. So with these guys that could penetrate the information system, like the internet and all these free access place where you can get information, we were able to expose these problems and have a voice in what was going on in my town. Then what happened later is something else, but like the festival went on for 5 years, in which we really were able to say something while everything else was, how can I say, was not able to do so. Like even protesters, there were a lot of little demonstrations in town, but they were immediately shut up, while these guys with their work could penetrate into the Facebook and all these little blogs around the world on the internet, and the voice will reach very remote corners of the world, and we were able to say something. And that was our personal rebellion at the time, just to make something entertaining again and cool in your town, and to talk about a very specific small reality, like my little town in southern Italy, and bring it up to the huge net of cultural relevant cities, you know? Like this kind of art now is, I mean, it's popular everywhere, right? You can find it in New York, in Paris, and whatever, but at the times, no small town had such a huge amount of work by these artists. And it was good to put this town back on the map, on an international map, so that a lot of people from abroad will come in town and check the work and maybe start to wonder, why is this guy painting a huge, I don't know, toxic waste dump, you know?
Yeah.
So we made our whole argument through the festival, and that was somehow rebellious, maybe, I guess.
Yeah, no, yeah, maybe. Well, and I don't want to embarrass you, but the other thing is too that it was a very homegrown thing. I mean, you know, the artist stayed with your grandmother.
Yeah.
Your mother cooked for them. And the reason I know this is because I heard about the festival through the artists, and they would say things to me like, oh, it's a great town, but the food is amazing. Yeah, we stayed with a grandmother, and he doesn't drive, so he, you know, the father picks us up and takes us. And if the father can't, then we walk. And he's like, and buckets of paint are heavy. So it was, you know, I mean, you guys, but it was, for you, the artists, you describe it, all of you describe it as very authentic.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, what I think is actually interesting about what Angelo did is that just at the moment when this thing just got total acceptance and love, what did he do? He quit doing it and started doing other stuff. And I think that there's just something about the way, you know, you arrive at the airport, you get picked up, mom is cooking for you, like you're, all of a sudden you're in this family and you're
This
like—
is your piece, by the way, in the convent in Grottaglie.
You're like, I've never been so comfortable. And then you realize the sort of motivation, this kind of contrarian, sort of passionate motivation of this person who does it until the point at which it doesn't have the subversive effect. And then he says, I'm interested in something else, which I think is such a common theme here, so.
Yeah, I mean, no, the thing is, I mean, it's true, I got bored. Basically, I got bored. Not because I'm restless. The thing is, in years, this whole genre and movement lost, in my opinion, my very personal opinion, its communicative power. At least for what I can see. So that after 5 years saying things loud and stuff, a lot of other cities, even in my region, in southern Italy, started to do the very same thing, but with very different backgroundings. It's like, I mean, we've been self-financing the festival since the first edition, selling the works of these artists at the same, in the same festival, right? So in a way, they were co-producing the festival, if not producing the festival, right? Together with my mom's cooking. And what happened is, give it 3 years' time, all the recognition from the media, all the legitimation from the media, which is what changed it also in town. Like, at first it was a war, right? These guys will come and paint huge walls, and everybody in town says, well, what is this about? I mean, is this a competition? I mean, who wins the prize? Who won last year? And, and then after a bit of legitimation by media, everybody else started to do the very same thing, but with sponsors, which was way more different than what we were doing, and with
permission.
Permission, and of course, with nothing to say other than wall decorations, right? And that's when I completely lost interest and went for something else, which is already boring.
But I'd like to talk about that evolution because, you know, you start with, I mean, Alex, you started with carving out the billboards initially and then led you to carving out physically on the walls. Caledonia, you took it a step further. You built boats and floated down the Mississippi, the Hudson, and then the Grand Canal. And when the Venetian Coast Guard stopped you in the middle of the day in your makeshift boats, and I'm sure you've seen them floating around behind us, you came back at night. And I have to tell you that you called me that night in Venice, and I didn't join you, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. But
it was amazing.
I'm sure. Can you talk about this idea, like taking it to that level?
Right. Well, you know, the boats actually started. There was somebody on the video this morning that gave up their citizenship at the time that George Bush was in office, and I had actually a quite similar thought moment where I was like, I'm leaving. I can't be a part of this. And then I was like, no. Go into the center. So I was like, what's the main artery of the country? It's the Mississippi River. How do you travel? Will you travel by tour bus? You travel by, how about by boat? By raft? So I had been sort of talking for years about boats, and finally, you know, there they are. I have a big community of friends that just make all kinds of incredible things, and I had just been talking shit for years and years. Oh, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. And then finally I was joined, here we are in the Adriatic, by a kind of a real logistics mastermind, and then all of a sudden it became possible. But at this point, I had just completed my first major solo show with Deitch Projects in New York, which was this huge gallery, and so people were like, what kind of a random thing are you doing? This is really not the path that we would expect you to see. Like, you have a foot into the mainstream art world right now. Why aren't you running with that? Why are you leaving, not joining major shows, and just kind of heading down the Mississippi? And for me, it was, I think, sort of similar to Angelo, of just feeling like if my passion, the only thing that's ever served me is to listen to that voice. And it's like a little kind of bratty little child that's like, I want to do this. And I'm just like, it's servant, okay, we want to do this, okay, no worries, we'll do this. And it just drags me around by the hair and I follow it around whatever it wants to do. And so you'll also see there's slides of work that we did in Haiti. This is Haiti after the earthquake. And so for me, starting to work on the wall was this moment of kind of breaking through something similar to what you're doing. Like you needed to sort of break through this kind of illusion that you didn't have agency, and this illusion that the world was a one-way communication stream with advertisements and all these things, and that you as a human being couldn't make something with your own two hands that would somehow penetrate that. And so for me, making the wheat pastes was that sort of initial act of like, okay, I'm gonna make contact in a way. And then I saw that reflected back to me, and I would hear personal stories of the way that had affected people's lives, and I would feel sort of empowered by being like, I opened up that space as a space for public discourse in a different way than it had been 20 minutes ago. And then I started to sort of feel the energy that had come from that and be like, wait a minute, what other sorts of seemingly impossible things can we do? And so when I started talking about building my own rafts on the Mississippi, and most people were, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that. And another friend of mine said, oh, do you know the floating neutrinos? But they built their own raft and went transatlantic. And I was like, oh, really? So I met those guys, they taught us how to build boats. And it was kind of this process of sort of pulling the string, and then all of a sudden, what becomes possible is larger. And I really loved what Regina said yesterday about the 10%, because I remember, and it's much less serious, we were not battling childhood cancer, we were just kind of doing ridiculous, crazy interventions, but somebody said, your chance of going in the Grand Canal without, some kind of horrific thing happening is about 5%, and I was like, 5%? That's loads, we can do that. Anyway, I see we're running out of time, so I'll stop there. But
no, and it's really important, because a lot of what you guys have done is empower others and recognize others. And the project in Haiti, in many ways, is a platform to enable people to build back their homes and community centers. But Alex, you in China, in Shanghai, you did a project where you went in to communities where people were being displaced, met the people, interviewed them, and portrayed them. What led you to do that? I mean, you didn't want to go to Chinese jail.
No, not really, no. But basically, specifically the project in China, we tried to do the project by legally, like, getting the permits of everyone involved and so on, and it was kind of difficult to get it, because as soon as we were starting, there was there was a problem, and we could not do it anymore. So we eventually started to realize that we needed to do it somehow, and we got in touch with these communities that were sort of being displaced from the center of the city, and they were being pushed out to outside of the city. And this was a team that I worked before, because it comes from the uniformization of when urban and cities started to be propagated in the world, and this destruction that led to change affects local people a lot of times, and this was the first project that we did, and then eventually we did also in Brazil with the World Cup and so on. There was a lot of favelas that were pacified and people were pushed out also. And I started to realize that the work was getting a lot of attention for the team and for what I was talking about, and then we eventually ended up in Providencia in one of the favelas, and we interviewed. As soon as we arrived, there was like several homes that were completely crushed down. There was no space between them, and then we went to investigate who were the people that were living there, and often there were people that were there for a long time. We interviewed them. They talked about their life, how the council dealt with them with the situation. We took a portrait and we carved it back on what was remaining of the wall where these people were living. And this, for the people, was sort of a link, because I mean, what was remaining of the house had their faces in it, so they were kind of got back the space, but also it creates an image that symbolizes what was happening, which was the destruction of, it's not just the houses, the communities that were gathering together for so many years, and suddenly when there is a pacification, they are just being pushed out for reality state development and progress. And people would be pushed down like 200 kilometers out of the center of the city. So, and this generated discussion, and then eventually there was more dialogue. It was not totally me, there was the riots and so on that drove a lot of attention to these problems with the changes that we're going through, specifically in Rio and Brazil. But it kind of created an image that spreads around newspapers and media that kind of affect the people. And this was the motto of the work, was to, you know, use my art as a weapon for the people to
give a
heard
voice to those who don't have one.
in a way. And yeah, it's and that's the motto of those body of work. That also talks about how, you know, these policies are independently of the space, of the language, of the economically background or socially background of the people that are in these environments, in these cities everywhere in the world, that are getting more and more uniformitized. And this is the way of sort of getting them some voice back.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we have run out of time, so, but Angelo, what is next for you with Chaos? What are you going to bring us? If you don't have an answer now, you can email us, but what is it?
Can't tell.
You can't tell? Okay.
Not yet.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.